Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Now, we have a very full show today. After the news, we'll be talking with Dmitry Dakhnovsky about his recent SR22 purchase and our flight together moving it from Indianapolis to California. Later, we'll have some of your emails and comments. Thanks so much for sending those, as I love hearing from you and sharing them on the show. Last week in episode 214, we talked with Rob Mark about the crash of a Learjet that occurred near San Diego while the aircraft was landing in poor weather at night. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/214. And as you think about your goals for 2022, let me suggest that one of them be to help support this show, as we're a listener-supported show and still ad-free. You can sign up as a member at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, winds destroyed a number of GA aircraft in Alaska. A GA pilot who was fired wins a nearly $2 million jury award. Texas police are looking for a pilot who disappeared after a crash, and we'll tell you why. And we have a Christmas pony story involving a pilot, because, hey, who doesn't like a pony story? All this and more, and the news starts now. From the Anchorage Daily News, at Palmer's Airport, volunteers helped to secure planes as winds tossed them. Last week, Don Hammond watched as powerful winds at the Palmer Municipal Airport grabbed a hold of his 6-seat flight-seeing plane and, quote, threw it around like a toy, he said. The plane crashed upside down onto the icy pavement. Hammond's Piper PA-32 Cherokee 6 was one of at least 5 aircraft that were totaled during that severe windstorm that has caused mayhem and left thousands without power for days in near-zero temperatures. Some of the hangars and many planes sustained damage, Hammond said. He estimates that there was well over $1 million in damage at the airport. But it could have been worse. Without help from other plane owners and Good Samaritans who worked with him to secure planes at the airport, Hammond said that loose aircraft could have added much more chaos and damage during the already intense storm. The National Weather Service reported a peak gust of 79 miles an hour at the Palmer Airport and 88 miles per hour elsewhere in Palmer. Hammond said he was recording with a handheld wind meter, and his readings were as high as 110 to 120 miles per hour. From FortThomasMatters.com, Boone County jury awards nearly $2 million to pilot fired for refusing to fly in unsafe conditions. A pilot was awarded $1.99 million in damages by a Boone County jury after he was fired for refusing to fly to the Caribbean as a hurricane threatened. The award includes $1.3 million in punitive damages. According to the pilot Ray Justinek, the weather conditions made it unsafe to fly that day. He informed his employers he would check conditions on the following day, and if they were safe, he would fly then. When he called in the next day to discuss the situation, he was told the company had hired a temporary pilot to make the trip the night before. A few days later, he was informed he no longer worked for the company. Justinek had close to 50 years of experience flying, first for law enforcement and then for Delta Airlines. In January 2017, after retiring from Delta, he took a position flying a private plane for Columbia Sussex. The company operates about 40 hotels, including the Westin Dawn Beach Resort and Spa in St. Martin. The hotel incurred damages when the island was hit by Irma, a Category 4 hurricane, in September 2017. The company later filed for $175 million in insurance claims. According to the complaint filed by Justinek, the owners asked him to load the airplane and fly relief supplies and insurance adjusters to the site to assess damages. He would also transport employees of the hotel off the island. The plan was for him to first fly to San Juan in Puerto Rico and wait there until he could continue on to St. Martin. He came in on a Saturday and helped load the plane with shovels, rakes, and cleaning supplies, but said he was concerned about weather conditions and where he might stop to fuel up or if he encountered mechanical issues or other concerns during the flight. After checking weather, he informed his company contact that it was unsafe to fly that day and offered to keep an eye on the weather with the hope that the next day's conditions would be more favorable. His attorney explained that his client believed that the weather did not look good. Quote, he gets home about 4 p.m. and starts looking at some weather information. His position was, I'm 69 years old. I've been loading a plane for 4 hours with 2,000 pounds of stuff. I'm not in the position to fly 3.5 hours in any kind of weather. Which, by the way, to me sounds like good judgment. At another point, another Hurricane Jose was approaching the area, and winds had been picking up, he said. Justin told Booker he called in Saturday night and said he was not flying anywhere that night, and it was looking iffy for the next day as well. Only a few weeks after it was let go, Justinek received a letter from the company stating that he would be sued if he did not return $20,000 for his training costs. Total cost of the training for the type rating was $34,000. and he'd signed an agreement that if he left the company within 2 years, he'd have to pay back a prorated portion of the training expense. Booker said his client's biggest concern was the damage done to his reputation. Having to explain his firing and a pending lawsuit for training expenses, he said, would ruin his chances of being hired elsewhere. Booker said the award was a welcome end to a long drawn-out case. I think at the end of the day, what he was most happy with was there was some validation that he was in fact making the right decision as a pilot. From aeronews.net, here's our pony story. Zenith CH-650 pilot saves a pony at Christmas time. In this case, it's another case of a Zenith to the rescue. Pilot Jerry Ebke noted via Facebook that his nephew's little boys received a pony for Christmas in rural southeastern Nebraska. But the old-time pony joy was short-lived as the four-legged Christmas gift was spooked by their dog and ran off. The search started in earnest. Many Facebook posts, stops at neighbors, and driving roads had been unsuccessful in locating Scout the pony. Jerry's not only a pilot, but he has a Zenith CH-650 with a big bubble canopy from which to start air-to-ground search missions. He started flying a grid search over the area, and on the fourth pass was lucky enough to see Scout in a tree line. Some cell phone conversations, some quick driving to a spot while I circled overhead, and Scout was safely brought home to the delight of both parents and boys. A very satisfying flight. So what started as a very happy holiday was saved by a resourceful pilot, his trusty CH-650, and the fact that he was a caring uncle ready to save the day. Great story, I love that. From AOPA.org, Delta drops their degree requirement for pilot applicants. Delta Airlines pilot recruiting announced on January 6th the airline is no longer turning away applicants who don't have a bachelor's degree. In a statement, the Atlanta-based airline announced that pilot applicants will no longer need a 4-year degree to be considered for employment as a first officer. After a comprehensive review of our pilot hiring requirements, Delta has decided to make a 4-year college degree preferred rather than required for first officer candidates effective immediately, the pilot recruitment team stated in a release. While we feel as strongly as ever about the importance of education, there are highly qualified candidates, people who we want to welcome to our Delta family, who have gained more than the equivalent of a college education through years of life and leadership experience. Making the 4-year degree requirement preferred removes unintentional barriers to our Delta flight deck. And by the way, a lot of experts do recommend that future airline pilots get a bachelor's degree because it could turn out to be handy if you're furloughed at some point in the future and need to find another job. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot forced to land on dirt road when he doesn't know how to turn on airport lights. The pilot reported that upon arrival at the airport in 29 Palms, California after dark, he attempted to activate the pilot-controlled lighting by keying the mic 7 times. He waited a short period and repeated the process 2 more times, but the lights did not turn on. He circled the area to try and locate the airport, but was unsuccessful. He was now low on fuel, so he began to look for a place to make a precautionary landing. The Cessna 150 landed on a dirt road. During the landing rollout, the nose landing gear separated and the left wing was substantially damaged. The pilot reported that there were no mechanical malfunctions or failure with the airplane that would have precluded normal operation. The FAA chart supplement identified that medium-intensity runway lights were available at the airport. To activate the pilot-controlled lighting, the pilot has to key the mic 5 times in 5 seconds for medium or low-intensity lights. The pilot reported that he did not check what the proper procedures were for operating the lighting for the runway. Airport personnel performed a check of the lighting system the following day and reported that there were no malfunctions. Probable cause, the pilot's poor pre-flight planning, during which he failed to verify the proper procedures to activate the runway lights, his inability to locate the airport without lighting, and the airplane's subsequent low fuel state as he circled looking for the airport, which necessitated a precautionary off-airport landing, during which the nose landing gear separated. And we have 2 stories regarding the Reed Hillview Airport near San Jose, California. The first comes from MercuryNews.com, county running more lead testing at Reed Hillview, San Martin airports. In the wake of a study that concluded San Jose's Reed Hillview Airport exposes children to high levels of lead, Santa Clara County is doing further testing at the site and the county-owned airport in San Martin to understand the extent of contamination. While the most recent study in August investigated blood lead levels of those living in the surrounding area of Reed Hillview, the new round of testing will look into how contaminated the soil is at each airport to determine whether the ground needs to be dug up and replaced with new earth. The results of the new testing, expected in March, are bound to add fuel to the ongoing debate surrounding the future of Reed Hillview. Reed Hillview and San Martin residents claim that the August study did not account for other potential factors that revealed high levels of lead and say that relocating the San Jose airport would put a strain on the much smaller one in San Martin. The best solution, they argue, is to switch all planes at Reed Hillview to unleaded fuel, a county-led initiative that began this January. And the second story comes from SanJoseSpotlight.com, FAA to investigate Santa Clara County leaded fuel ban at airports. The FAA has started a formal investigation into Santa Clara County's policy to ban the sale of unleaded fuel at its airports starting January 1. In a letter sent to the county, the FAA said it will investigate to determine whether the policy is a violation of the U.S. Constitution and other FAA guidelines. It also advised the county to halt the ban on leaded fuel implemented by county supervisors because of concerns of lead toxicity around Reed-Hillview. The investigation is a result of complaints leveled by AOPA and other industry groups. On December 14th, the coalition sent a letter to the FAA in a last-ditch effort to reverse the leaded fuel bans. The industry group also claims the county is refusing to grant long-term leases to pilots once their term expires on December 31st, another claim the FAA is investigating. The FAA gave the county 20 days to respond instead of its usual 30, since it found, quote, the circumstances required expedited handling of a particular case or controversy. The coalition pushing for the FAA to act believes stopping the sale of leaded 100 low-lead fuel at county airports could lead to misfueling or using the wrong type of fuel, which could lead to engine failures. Some airplane engines in the U.S. are not approved to use unleaded fuel. Airplanes that can use a lower-octane unleaded formulation must get a certificate to legally use that fuel. County Supervisor Chavez told the San Jose Spotlight, referring to discussions that took place on closing Reed-Hillview Airport, that the primary obligation for the county and her was to ensure the safety and health of residents, noting lead levels, regardless how small, have irreversible impacts on child development, according to a county commission study. And there have been a number of ATC Zero events at various towers over the last few weeks. This first one comes from liveatc.net. A poster wrote, the first exchange appears to KBUR Tower, that's the Burbank, California Tower, with an aircraft preparing for departure, notifying them of the closure for cleaning for at least 2 hours. The second item is the actual ATC Zero announcement from the Burbank Tower. Interesting to hear that they note VFR traffic is not allowed during the ATC closure. An FAA NOTAM search indicates the tower was closed for over 3 hours. Initial scans of audio sounds like SoCal approach went to a one-in, one-out policy for Burbank as well. And from dfw.cbslocal.com, a story that says the tower at DFW Airport was closed due to health-related staffing shortage. The FAA put a ground stop in effect at DFW on December 29th for arriving traffic. The FAA said a staffing shortage related to multiple health and safety factors, including COVID-19, resulted in the temporary closure of the tower on the west side of the airport. All traffic was routed to the east side of the airport. Due to the reduction in capacity, the FAA temporarily halted all DFW-bound departures from other airports. And finally, from KSHB.com, this regards Kansas City International Airport. This primary air hub for the Kansas City region moved to ATC 0 shortly before 6 p.m., according to the official KCI Twitter account. The FAA staff were moved out of the tower cab, leaving the airport with no air traffic controllers for flights. With the worst of the storm having passed over an hour later, air traffic controllers were permitted to return to the tower, and the airport was set to reopen after a visual sweep to ensure there was no debris on the runway. And from GeneralAviationNews.com, new aircraft leasing company specializes in flight schools. Flight Finance, and that's spelled F-L-Y-T Finance, a Phoenix-based aircraft leasing company, has launched a new aircraft leasing program for Part 61 and Part 141 flight schools. Officials say they purchased a fleet of 2022 and 2023 Cessna 172 Skyhawks, Piper Archer TXs, and Piper Seminoles. They note they are focused on supporting flight school fleet development around the country. This is an unprecedented time in GA flight training, and we are excited to partner with flight schools and aviation degree programs who ensure they have the modern aircraft they need to support their flight training. Flight Finance will offer 5-year leases with purchase options, as well as flat monthly lease rates with no minimum flight hour requirements. Company officials add they also encourage flight school custom branding on their aircraft and will reserve aircraft a year in advance to help flight schools with fleet planning. The company is accepting reservations now for aircraft scheduled for factory delivery throughout 2022. From SimpleFlying.com, the FAA releases list of 50 airports with 5G buffers. The FAA has shared a list of airports that will have buffer zones when communication companies switch on the controversial new 5G C-band service on January 19th. The move follows the rise of notable concerns from authorities about the technology's impact on aviation safety. Last month, the FAA issued a pair of ADs to mitigate fears about the impact that C-band signals could have on operations. Ultimately, there are anxieties that the networks may interfere with an aircraft's radar altimeters, so in certain conditions, airline service could become disruptive. It should be noted that these factors only relate to the networks of Verizon and AT&T. T-Mobile also uses 5G, however, the company does not use the C-band spectrum. The FAA garnered input from the aviation industry where the proposed buffer zones would help reduce the risk of disruption. The organization took factors such as the number of low-visibility days, location, and traffic into consideration. Along with the list reveal, the FAA added crucial details about the overall impact. The group also shared information about the broader airport network. Quote, many airports are not currently affected by the new 5G deployment and are not on this list. These include airports not in the 46 markets where the new service will be deployed, and airports that do not currently have the ability to allow low-visibility landings, the FAA said. The wireless companies agreed to turn off transmitters and make other adjustments near these airports for 6 months to minimize potential 5G interference with sensitive aircraft instruments used in low-visibility landings. The FAA continues to work with the aerospace manufacturers and wireless companies to make sure 5G is safely deployed and to limit the risk of flight disruptions at all airports. The FAA this week warned that even with the temporary buffer around 50 sites, the new 5G deployment will increase the risk of disruption during low visibility. Diversions, cancellations, and delays could occur during low visibility periods. Now, my guess is there will be even more twists and turns to this story, and of course we'll keep you updated with those in the future. From BusinessOutsider.com, out-of-practice Qantas pilots try to take off with brakes on. Some Qantas pilots who were grounded during the pandemic have made basic errors since returning to flying, such as trying to take off with a parking brake engaged, according to an internal company memo obtained by the Sydney Morning Herald. Some have also mistaken altitude readings for airspeed readings, the memo to Qantas staff says. The memo highlights the difficulty faced by pilots who were grounded for long periods during the pandemic before returning to work. The heads of Qantas fleet operations say in the memo that pilots who haven't flown during the pandemic were slower with routine tasks and sometimes made errors. The Herald reported, quote, expert pilots have lost recency and experienced a subsequent reduction in cognitive capacity. And finally, from GoodWordNews.com, manhunt underway for suspect in Texas human trafficking plane crash. Authorities in the city of Presidio, West Texas, have issued an arrest warrant for the person suspected of piloting a single-engine plane with 5 migrants on board. The plane crashed shortly after takeoff from Presidio Airport. The Presidio County Sheriff's Office issued the arrest warrant for Tobias Penner Peters of Seminole, Texas. Presidio County Sheriff's deputies located the plane on the desert floor just north of the airport. With the help of police officers, Border Patrol officers, and local fire and EMS personnel, 5 passengers were located and treated for various injuries, some of them serious. Several of the injured migrants were transported to hospitals in El Paso for advanced treatment. The pilot fled shortly after the accident. The pilot, who authorities believe to be Penner, was also reportedly seriously injured. Penner is believed to have suffered serious head injuries and may have lost an eye in the crash. According to the police, a preliminary investigation revealed that excessive weight of passengers, 6 people in a 4-seat plane, and the lack of fuel could have contributed to the accident. Authorities have said that Penner has ties to Mexico. Penner faces charges of human trafficking, escape arrest, and fatal conduct. The Presidio region is in the least traveled Border Patrol sector along the southwest border due to its remoteness. The Big Bend sector has nonetheless seen as many as 100% increase in migrant crossings since last year in November. And we have one more news story that just came in from a listener, Isaac Alexander, just after I finished recording the news, with a link to one of the most amazing plane crash videos I have ever seen. This comes from the MercuryNews.com. Plane crashes in Los Angeles County, then is hit by train. Bystanders pulled the pilot from a plane that crash-landed Sunday on train tracks near San Fernando Valley Airport shortly before a train slammed into the wreckage. The Cessna 172 went down on the tracks adjacent to Whiteman Airport in Pacoima shortly after taking off around 2:10 p.m., LA Fire Department officials said. About 20 minutes later, a Metrolink train barreled into it, but its sole occupant had been pulled to safety. He's out of there. They've got him out, people were heard shouting in the video recorded at the scene by a news videographer with O.C. Hawk. Body camera footage from the officers involved appears to show that the pilot is a middle-aged man, but the pilot's name, age, and gender and condition have not yet been released. The pilot was transported to a hospital. No one on the ground or in the train was reported injured. The plane remained on the tracks as of 3 p.m. Sunday, halting all train traffic through the area. Portions of the plane's engine and fuselage, as well as broken railway crossing signs, littered the ground around the crash site. A small amount of fuel that leaked out of it was contained by firefighters. The cause of the emergency landing was under investigation by the FAA and the NTSB. Now, there's a video on Twitter which shows the moment the plane was totally destroyed by the train. One of the pieces of that plane can then be seen headed toward a bystander who shot the video, and you can see people running away from the flying debris. The video really looks like something straight out of a Hollywood movie, and I'm sure you'll want to see it. To find it, look for the link in our show notes at aviationnewstalk.com/215. And my thanks to Isaac Alexander for sending the video to me. You can follow his Twitter handle, which is @JetCityStar on Twitter. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a conversation with Dmitry Dakhnovsky about buying an SR22 and flying it across the country. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little bit about Dmitry Dakhnovsky. Dmitry is an instrument-rated pilot who started flying in 2011. He has 400 hours of time and is working on his commercial certificate. He manages a San Francisco Bay Area venture fund called Stereo Capital. And now here's our conversation with Dmitry Dakhnovsky. Dmitry, welcome to the show. Great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So tell us, how did you happen to end up buying an SR22, and what are your plans? How are you going to use it?
So I've been flying in the Bay Area for the past 10 years or so, primarily out of the West Valley Flying Club. And I've never experienced ownership. This is my first plane. So one of the ideas was to check it out, see how it works. And the other one is general aviation picked up around the Bay Area since COVID. And there seems to be a lot of high demand from local pilots for a Cirrus. So another objective, and I would say it's the primary objective, was to share that airplane with local pilots. It's a fast, solid aircraft, IFR equipped, lots of safety features. So putting it in our flight club at West Valley, and I hope it rents well.
Great. So it sounds like your primary use for the airplane is for renting, and also, I guess, creates a business and a tax deduction and things like that. So that's great. Now, you mentioned it has Fiki, but it's not turbocharged, right? So it's normally aspirated?
It is not. Yeah, it's normally aspirated. There's certainly a limitation here on high altitude operations, but also much easier to maintain in a club setting. So I think, from what I understand, the engine is less demanding and just easier to maintain.
Sure. I have heard folks express the belief that renters do not treat turbocharged engines as well as they treat normally aspirated engines. So that's certainly one consideration when buying an airplane to put on the line for rent. Talk a little bit about the buying process. You and I spent, collectively hours over a couple of months talking on the phone and text messages. What were some of the kinds of things that you were working through as part of the buying process?
Yeah, I think the goal was to buy something by the end of the year. I did start the process a little bit late, so I think it was probably early November. And there was a plane that was up for sale that I actually flew at the club, which I tried to purchase, bid on it, did not get it. And then I already had financing in hand, and I decided to go and see if there's anything else on the market. The market is extremely competitive, very fast moving. So I thought that I got super lucky with the option that I eventually found and executed on. But basically, there were a couple of things I tried. Obviously controller. I tried going to my local flying clubs and asking general managers if their Cirruses for sale. But in the end, I saw a listing that was, I think, put up just a couple of days, maybe a day before I saw it. It was November 15th, and contacted the owner. I think it took me 24 hours to bid on the plane. I checked with my general manager here at West Valley, and he thought it was a good plane that would fit the needs of our pilots. And basically, it was after that, it was the purchase agreement. I got Savvy to help me with the pre-buy. They were extremely efficient and quick, and got really good advice from them. And took me, I guess, 3 weeks from the time I found the plane to actually closing on it.
That is really quick, but it shows that if you have all your ducks lined up, you have financing available, and you have a plan for how to handle the pre-purchase inspection, you can sail right through this pretty quickly. Yes, and you mentioned the market being competitive. It's definitely a seller's market right now. Prices are high, inventory is low, and planes sell very, very, very quickly. Now, I'm wondering, thinking back, is there anything that you either found unexpected about the process or anything that you might do differently if you were doing it over again?
What would I do differently? I think I would start earlier for sure. That's a given. What was unexpected is how this process was different from the process just prior. I got super lucky with the previous owner. He's a CISIP out of Indianapolis exec. He is a former military and 747 pilot. Plane was extremely well maintained, not only so they have a Cirrus maintenance center right at the airport. In fact, I think it's flight school and FBO and a maintenance center in one. So I think this combination, it was quite unexpected how enjoyable that second process was compared to my first one.
That's great. I'm glad it worked out so well for you. And we certainly had a good time flying it back. Talk a little bit about the original flight plan. Originally, you had an idea where we would fly to Michigan and then Wyoming and so on. Talk about that and why you were interested in doing that and what changed.
Yeah. So with Michigan, there was a DPE. There was a DPE. Jason's a friend of yours, Max, that I wanted to see. And I was looking to get some paperwork done from my local FISDO, and it just sort of ended up not materializing and was just too long of a turnaround. And then flying through Wyoming, it's basically on the way to back to California. So we're flying the plane from Indy exec to Palo Alto, sort of the midpoint. And it also happens that my dad lives there. So I wanted to visit him. So I think another advantage, and I think we'll probably talk about this in terms of the planning that we did after, is Laramie lies at 7,000 feet, which saves us a little bit of time on descent and climb out.
Yeah. And then a couple of things that changed. For one, we had some weather that looked like it was going to be coming in from the northwest, and it was going to pretty much close out that northern route across Interstate 80 through Wyoming, Salt Lake City, and Reno, Nevada, which pretty much at that point either forced us to accept that we would have a delay of a couple days, or we would need to fly a more southerly route, which is what we ended up doing. And I would say that probably 80% of the time I end up flying a southern route across New Mexico and Arizona because there's just weather more often across that northern route. Now, as for Michigan, you were looking to get the restriction lifted for night flying. Jason has talked on the show before about testing that people can do to get around their limitations that they might have on their medicals for night flying, and he'll have an update on it pretty soon, which we'll bring to folks so that they can hear some of the things that he's learned about that in the process. So once you decided that the northern route really didn't make a lot of sense, you kind of zeroed in on Flagstaff, Arizona, which I thought was a great idea. How did you choose Flagstaff?
Yeah, so I think the southern route from kind of going around the Rockies, the southern end of the Rockies, and flying through Santa Fe, Albuquerque area, and down to Flagstaff is just beautiful. You're crossing lava fields. The Grand Canyon is right there. I think the idea was to get to Flagstaff right before sunset and just enjoy this beautiful, beautiful route. I think there are also a few practical benefits with Flagstaff. There's an FBO. You can get an Uber, great food, hotels. Again, altitude 7,000 feet as well. Long runway, and most importantly, there was no wind in Flagstaff at the time, so it should have been a very, very smooth landing.
I was looking forward to Flagstaff being our overnight destination for a couple of reasons. I had never been there before, and I've tried to land there multiple times on long cross-country flights, and each time there were adverse winds, and it was just the case where this time it would have been perfect. And so one of the key things I was looking at, since that was our goal, was could we make it with just a single stop? And unfortunately, we had strong headwinds the entire way, so it was pretty clear early in the flight planning process that was just not going to be the case. So that meant 2 stops to make it to Flagstaff, and I think that kind of formed the basis of our original planning. So Talk about when we arrived at Indianapolis Executive Airport early on Sunday morning. What were some of the kinds of things that you were working on with the owner and the airplane before we left?
I think we wanted to make sure that the plane was properly fueled. We had oxygen on board, again, full oxygen, full FICI. We knew we're going to, because of the storm coming into California, we knew we wanted that option. And flying across over or around the Rockies, we would have to be at higher altitude. So that was important.
Yeah, and one of the things that we discovered was that we didn't have the oxygen regulators that we thought were going to be in the airplane. Apparently, they had been stolen just a week or two prior. So I had my own oxygen regulator and mask, but that meant since you didn't have one, that pretty much limited the altitudes that we could fly at. Looking at ForeFlight, we could see that we would have actually picked up a speed advantage if we'd gotten up into the mid-teens or upper teens, but unfortunately that just wasn't viable. And even if it had been viable, even if we did have both sets of oxygen mask, we would have been looking at probably close to 9 hours of flying with oxygen mask. And I got to tell you, having the cannula stuck up your nose for that long, that's not that much fun.
Yeah, I think the owner was also very surprised that the oxygen stuff was removed from the plane. I mean, we don't know if it was stolen or just misplaced, and he was gracious enough to basically overnight the oxygen package to California. So that did not help us during the flight, but again, kudos to the previous owner. It was just an amazing experience. I think I did sort of think that could a possibility that we're not going to have oxygen. I did take an oxygen bottle with me. So even when we did climb up to 10,000 feet, I had a source of air, every couple of minutes if I needed it. So that was certainly a good backup strategy there.
Sure, that was one of those small handheld push to breathe kinds of things as opposed to a kind of continuous system. But that's great to be able to get some oxygen. So on the first leg, I originally, when I was trying to figure out if we could do it in just one stop, had been looking at the Oklahoma City area, but it became really clear that would be marginal and highly unlikely. So we picked a strategy of just planning for 2 stops. I originally suggested Wichita, and you picked a little airport right next to it in Augusta. And why did you choose that airport?
I think a couple of reasons. I felt like Wichita is a larger airport. It would probably be a little bit more taxi time, probably be more traffic, and we'll just lose a little bit of time. Also, fuel. I think fuel at Wichita was a little bit more expensive. I mean, not by much, but that was one consideration. This was lunchtime. We decided not to have lunch at an FBO or a local restaurant. We just took sandwiches with us. So that was also something that I think it enabled us to land at a smaller airport where there would be no food at the airport.
Yes, I like doing that. That's a huge advantage to be able to bring your food with you because you can easily lose an additional hour just running around to try and find food at a local airport. So that made a heck of a lot of sense. Now, one of the trade-offs I mentioned for stopping at a really small airport is, there's some chance that they may have run out of gas, unlikely at a larger airport. So we talked about phoning ahead. In our rush to leave, that was one thing that we didn't do, was phone ahead just to confirm that they had gas. And fortunately, it all worked out. They did have gas. So that was a pretty quick turnaround. Now, on that leg, since we had planned to have 2 fuel stops, we knew we'd have a pretty big cushion of fuel when we landed. So we were able to run at 75% power. We didn't have to worry about running at lower power settings to extend our range. Had we done that, tried to do 1 fuel stop by flying slowly, we never would have made it all the way home. We would have added hours to the trip because of the slower flight for that. Let's see. And so I think we saw headwinds. I kind of remember that they were always at least 25 knots and occasionally as much as 45 knots.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So our next stop was Santa Fe. What do you remember about that leg?
Just the scenery was beautiful. You fly west, the terrain obviously rises, so you get closer to the ground. Just southwestern Colorado is beautiful when you start getting into those small canyons. I mean, you're obviously not getting into the canyons, but you fly over canyons. I think the other one was we decided to pick a point not to cross the Rockies at 11,000, 12,000 feet, not climb, but stay, I think we're at 8,000, and follow Interstate 25 that sort of goes around the southern end of the mountains there. Also, I think helpful not to gain a lot of altitude because Santa Fe is right on the other side of the mountain. So the descent is much smoother. And the flight was just beautiful. We were landing into the sunset. There was no wind, extremely smooth landing, just a beautiful, beautiful place there.
Yeah, you raise a great point. Another issue is had we flown a direct route and climbed to fly over that mountain between us and Santa Fe, we likely would have picked up a lot more turbulence because we had significant headwinds. And of course, when those hit the mountains, they generate significant turbulence. So we essentially followed the interstate a little bit to the south to go down around that mountain, which allowed us to stay low. And really, frankly, I only remember one solid bump on the entire flight across the country. And it wasn't until we got back into California. So we really lucked out on the turbulence side. So after we left Santa Fe, we decided to flight plan to Bakersfield because the hop to Flagstaff would have been so short. We were feeling fine. It was still early in the evening. We decided to keep going on. And I would say that that's something that we did throughout the entire flight was constantly look at alternatives. Always had a plan B, whether to go further or whether to come up short. Talk about the criteria that we were using in terms of how much fuel that we wanted to land at and how we managed that for each of our legs.
Yeah, we want to make sure we have at least 20 gallons of fuel left when we land. The plane has 92 gallons of usable fuel, and it burns between 13 to 20 gallons an hour, depending on power settings, and if you have to climb, obviously it burns more. So 20 gallons sounds like a good conservative hour of flight, just in case there's a scenario where, whether weather related or traffic related, that we would have to execute on and make sure we get to our destination, or, go to an alternate.
Yeah, and so I think on this particular leg, this was the one leg where if we had run at 75% power, we weren't sure, at least at the beginning of the leg, that we would land with 20 gallons. And so we actually flew slower. I think we were at 65% running lean of peak. And initially that showed that we would land with 27 gallons, which was pretty good. We also had a feeling that the headwinds would diminish somewhat toward the end of that leg, though we weren't quite sure of that. And so I like to go slow in the beginning, and then when it's clear that you're going to make it, go fast, 75% power. And in fact, that's what we did. We ended up toward the end, the last hour and a half, running at 75% power. And once again, we did land with about 20 gallons. Now, there was an interesting consideration for Bakersfield, which I hadn't really expected. Why were we concerned about getting into Bakersfield late?
Yeah, so the only FBO, and we're flying on a Sunday, the only FBO that was still open in the evening was Signature, but it was closing at 9 p.m. So we wanted to make sure we get there. There's no self-fuel option at Bakersfield, so we wanted to make sure we get there before 8:30, 8:45 to make sure we got fuel.
Yeah, that was kind of a surprise to me, but it was good that we found that out ahead of time. Now, one of the big challenges coming across the southern route in the desert is that you have to fly out of the way because of the large restricted area around Edwards Air Force Base. So people usually end up flying all the way to Palmdale, VOR, and then heading north from there. Now, we checked very early on to find out, since it was a Sunday, were perhaps some of those restricted areas cold, so could we fly through them? And you talk about what you did with ForeFlight once we did find out that those restricted areas were cold to give us the most efficient route to bend around the restricted areas that were still hot.
Yes, so with this plane is equipped with a feature that allows automatic syncing between ForeFlight or Garmin and the Cirrus. So I had our flight plan loaded on my iPad and ForeFlight, and I was basically dragging a waypoint on the flight plan and my ForeFlight to make sure we stay outside of the restricted area that was hot. And then the great feature there is you can send the plan back to Garmin, to Cirrus, and basically got spared of creating a user waypoint in Garmin and in the Cirrus. And it was just a very easy way to flight plan that particular situation.
Yes, you're right. My initial thought when we faced the challenge of how to get around the restricted areas was create 2 or 3, however many waypoints we needed custom in the perspective, which is kind of the Cirrus's version of the G1000, to kind of bend our way around the various restricted areas. But I think you showed that it was really much faster and easier to essentially rubber band the route you had by dragging the magenta line around on the screen. I was really surprised, frankly, at how quickly you were able to do that. It was a really very effective solution.
I think there's another awesome feature with ForeFlight that allows you to much more easily input into your flight plan. Whereas in the perspective or in the G1000, you have to use the knobs to specify, to find the airway and then select the entry and exit points. In ForeFlight, you just type in the airway designation and sync it back to Cirrus. And it's really, really quick once if ATC gives you an instruction to alter your flight plan.
Yeah, it worked extremely well. So cutting through the restricted area and moving back up to 75% power shaved a full 20 minutes off of our time en route. And originally it looked like we were going to be landing about 8:45. I think we landed at 8:25, which gave us plenty of margin before they closed at 9 o'clock. And of course, then the big question was, do we feel good enough to continue on, or should we stay? But this was, frankly, the most challenging portion of the entire route, not just because we faced potential fatigue, but also because for the first time in the flight, we were going to be encountering weather. There was a line of heavy precipitation, which basically cut off our entire route to San Jose or Palo Alto. Our destination ultimately was Palo Alto, which is the home airport for you and I. It's a fairly small airport. Talk about some of the different options we considered for what we might use as a next stop, trying to get closer to our destination.
Yeah. And just for context, it's been a very long day. Even though we didn't get a lot of turbulence along the way, it was still a very long day. So that was something we're definitely tired. We wanted to get home. However, we did agree before the flight that if one of us feels uncomfortable in continuing the flight, we would call it a night and just stay at a hotel locally. That was another reason, by the way, why we picked Bakersfield, is that there are hotels in Bakersfield where we could stay overnight. The other challenge with this flight was the storm system. So the storm system was coming in on Sunday, but there was a cold front moving into the Bay Area on Monday with high winds picking up sometime around midday on Monday. So getting home on a Sunday with freezing levels at 8,000 feet would have been much more preferable than flying into Palo Alto, the Bay Area, the next day, lots of wind and facing lower freezing levels because it was still raining. So that's something that we've researched and talked a lot about before the flight and throughout the flight. That was one of the decisions we made to continue the flight from Bakersfield to the Bay Area to see that we can avoid lower freezing levels the next day. There were a couple of options we looked at. There was one where we would try to fly into the Bay Area through the Central Valley. Another one was flying into the Bay Area through Salinas, which is another valley and follow 101. That's another highway that goes south-north into the Bay Area. We looked at maybe staying at Modesto, filing into Modesto, which is close enough to the Bay Area, but still not over the mountains that surround the Bay Area. And we finally settled on flying into Salinas, which is also outside of the Santa Cruz Mountains range that surrounds the Bay Area from the southwest.
Yes. So looking at the Modesto from there, if we flew on the next day, we might have been able to make it VFR, but the minimum altitude to get to Palo Alto VFR probably would have been probably 2,500 feet, something like that. And we still would have had at least 2 more mountain passes to go through, which might have made that difficult. Salinas, on the other hand, probably could fly all the way up the following day, VFR, if conditions permitted. At, I would say even 2,000 feet, we'd have no mountain passes, really. It would be pretty clear shot the entire way, and that valley is somewhat protected. So we did file to Salinas. because the line of heavy precipitation was just north of Salinas. Now, Salinas is about 50 miles south of our ultimate destination of Palo Alto. But as we were getting closer to Salinas, we noticed that the rain was starting to create some holes that looked like we might be able to get through. So what did we talk to ATC about?
Yeah, I think we asked ATC to route us around the heaviest precipitation, just vector us around. We were IFR at that time. And even though they were super busy, for some reason, they were super busy on Sunday night, we got our route and flew into San Jose.
Yep. And I suggested that we fly into San Jose because the forecast was for wind shear 45 knots at 2,000 feet. And sure enough, when we got to San Jose, the airliner that was landing in front of us had to go around, and they said the reason was wind shear. And then the second airliner behind us also did a go around. So we had two airliners go around within a few minutes, which is pretty unusual. You don't see airliners doing go arounds very often. I didn't notice any wind shear as we came in. We did fly the ILS for 1-2 right. And of course, anytime you're flying at night and you've got any kind of weather, it makes sense to fly an instrument approach, which we did. As we were at perhaps 1,000 feet, the tower controller asked us if we could switch to 1-2 left. And I told him no, we'd like to stay on 1-2 right. And the reason I did was we already had the ILS dialed in. We had the autopilot going on. We had significant crosswinds. And to me, it just seemed pointless to try and suddenly change things at that altitude when everything was just dialed in and it looked like we were all set up. And then ultimately, we decided not to go into Palo Alto because with the late hour, the heavy winds, the weather, it just would have not made any sense at all. So we ended up about 10 miles short of our destination and then moved the aircraft the following day. Let's see, the one odd thing I remember was on our last leg, as it was just starting to get dark, we noticed that the overhead light was on and that we could not figure out how to turn that off. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was a funny moment. So there's a red handle that deploys the parachute, and it's covered by a placard. And what I do is I remove the placard and put it back up halfway. So it certainly it helps me to get reminded that I do have a parachute. And also, if there's a passenger next to me who doesn't know that there's a parachute or might have forgotten that there was a parachute, obviously sees the red handle. So, but basically what ended up happening is that placard covered the light switches. So we were looking for it for maybe 5 minutes and we couldn't find the light switches. I think it took Max, it took you a few texts with somebody who knew what the problem was, and we finally figured it out.
Yeah, it's pretty funny because I do relatively little flying at night, and I'm in a variety of different Cirruses, different model years. Certainly the earlier ones don't have that particular switch there. So I kept focusing on the light, couldn't find any switch near it, and totally forgot that the switch was now hidden by the cover, which was displaced slightly so that the handle would be exposed so that we could get to it easily. So yes, I want to thank my various friends who I texted who finally mentioned that I should be looking under the cover, so that worked out. Well, all in all, great trip. As we start to wrap up here, kind of any final thoughts about the trip?
What was very valuable is having two people fly this back across, especially that very last leg where we were fatigued and there was inclement weather, where we had to make multiple calls that were not easy. I think I probably wouldn't have made those calls, and I probably would have stayed in Bakersfield or Salinas, crossed into the weather system, into San Jose or Palo Alto, had I flown this by myself. But the other comment is, and I was just thinking about this today, that I think we just want to stay humble here as pilots, both in front of capacity as pilots. I mean, we do get tired, but also weather. And this is something not to mess around with. And I'm still at this point, I'm not 100% certain that we made the right call to go back to San Jose from Bakersfield, flying into the storm. The thought that keeps running in my head is whether while we were fatigued, we were making the right decision.
Well, I agree. That's probably the one area that I continue to think about. If I had been flying this trip alone under the same circumstances, I would not have gone beyond Bakersfield because to me it would be silly to continue on with just one pilot. But with how easy the first part of the trip was, and given that we had two people, and I'd been frankly breathing oxygen for a good portion of the last leg, so I was feeling pretty good. And all in all, I think it worked out pretty well. I think we had outs at every step of the way. At any point in time, we could have turned around and gone back to another place. So I think that's probably the most important thing, is that we were continually evaluating options the entire way. We always made sure that we had a plan B or a plan C, and I think that was probably the key to success.
Yeah. And just to add to this, I think it was an awesome learning experience. And thanks to you, this was a very memorable, but also an extremely valuable lesson in how to fly cross country and how to fly inclement weather.
Yeah, there's no question. Flying a really long trip is very different from short cross countries, and it's a great learning experience. Well, Dmitry, thank you so much for joining us here today and sharing your experience with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And my thanks to Dmitry for joining us on the show. And if you're perhaps thinking of buying a Cirrus just like he did, and maybe you're even struggling with whether to buy new or used, please contact me. I'd be happy to talk on the phone, and I'm sure there are ways that I can help. You can reach me by going to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. Coming up next, your emails and questions, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's get to the good news department. First, congratulations to Patreon supporter Jackson Maddox, who passed his instrument rating. That's awesome. And Mega supporter Jim Goldfuss writes that he passed the oral portion of his CFI check ride, but didn't get to fly due to weather. He said that oral was 6 hours long, and he was shot afterwards. Well, I'm not surprised. Congratulations, Jim. You're almost there. And before I get to your emails, I want to mention that I've just posted a video of Rattlesnake Mountain, which is adjacent to the runway 27 right final to Gillespie Field in El Cajon, California. That's the mountain that the Learjet crew was headed straight toward, and they crashed last month at the base of the mountain. That's the accident we talked about last week in episode 214. The video was shot by Brandon Gonzalez of the Podcasting on a Plane podcast. He was the CFI on board, and they were making right traffic to 27 right. The crew of the Learjet 35A that crashed in December was flying left traffic to 27 right, in poor visibility at night. I've included a link to the video in our show notes, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/215, and my thanks to Brandon for letting me share this video with all of you. Now, we had lots of email about last week's episode and about the accident, so let's get to that. First, from Mega supporter Carl Rossi. He said, "Listen to your podcast this morning while running in Mission Trails Park, which is in those hills immediately west of the Gillespie Field. Seems sadly appropriate. Our San Diego condo is located on the western edge of Mission Trails Park, roughly equidistant between Gillespie Field and Montgomery Field. Gillespie Field is less expensive to base an aircraft at than Montgomery, but the terrain around Montgomery is far more forgiving, and the approaches are better, hence our decision to base our aircraft at Montgomery Field. Couple of observations. One, first clue as to the terrain around Gillespie is the name of the city which the airport is located in. El Cajon means the box or the drawer in Spanish. Montgomery Field would likely not have been an option for this crew, although 28 right is 4,600 feet long and has an ILS. There is also a displaced threshold, meaning only 3,300 feet available for landing on 28 right, so it's even shorter than 17 at Gillespie Field. On occasion, jets will land on 10 left, which gives them 4,600 feet, but it's a pain for the tower to change the airport configuration to accommodate. San Diego Lindbergh Field would have been by far the better alternative. Palomar Airport would have been a good choice as well, a bit farther away, but has an ILS and is used to lots of Part 135 jets. Number 3, Rattlesnake Mountain is not completely unlit. There are houses on the slopes overlooking the airport and the ridgetop, so presumably the crew would have had some visual clue as to proximity beyond suddenly seeing the hill loom up in the landing lights, assuming that somebody was watching over the nose, as opposed to both pilots trying to acquire the runway. 4, Gillespie Field is somewhat unique in my experience in that when one is flying the normal VFR pattern to 28 right traffic, You fly the downwind to the north and northeast of Rattlesnake Mountain and turn right base once past the mountain. You typically lose sight of the airport on the downwind and do not reacquire until on base about to turn final. It's not pertinent to this accident, but first-time visitors to Gillespie Field who are assigned right traffic 27 right often do not understand this and turn a very close-in base west of Rattlesnake, both cutting off planes on final and also making for one heck of a short approach. 5. 400 feet AGL makes no sense whatsoever unless maneuvering to remain VMC. Considering the weather that night, the ceilings could easily have been that variable, plus the rain and mist would have done a fine job of obscuring the view. What a waste. Thanks so much for your observations, Carl. And here's an email from patron supporter Brooks Duro. He says, sad about the crash here south of me. Enjoyed your thoughts on the events leading up to the crash in your conversation with Rob Mark. The thought occurred to me that as they had canceled their IFR flight plan, now VFR, and perhaps entered back into IMC or lost visual with the runway or all of the above, it seems they would not have been able to initiate a missed approach technically by heading toward the airport directly and then flying the published missed approach. While I believe from my training that would be the appropriate thing to do if still IFR, I'm not sure how they would accomplish that other than declaring an emergency and then requesting to fly the missed approach or get vectors immediately and climb back into IMC. It was astounding to me that they allowed themselves to get into this situation. I've flown the localizer D several times, including the partial panel into 27 right, and Rattlesnake Mountain is right there on the right, which is a circling approach regardless to keep you high enough. You then do the circling approach and end up where they were looking at Rattlesnake Mountain. I would never want to do that at night in marginal weather for sure. Unfortunate loss for all. Keep up the great work. And here's an email from Zach in Texas. He writes, Hi Max, I very much enjoyed your breakdown of the Learjet crash in California, a very tragic and preventable occurrence. You mentioned the ATC audio in your posting, so I tracked it down and listened to it. I do have a question about the veracity of the audio and wanted to bounce it off you. I'm an Austin-based private Mooney pilot with an instrument rating. Please let me know when you have a free minute to talk. Cheers, Zach. And he and I exchanged some email. I told him that a lot of people who listen to the ATC audio on a YouTube video got misled because much of the quiet time between the transmissions was removed. So many people think that the pilots asked to have the airport lights turned up just before the crash. But in fact, that transmission occurred while they were still north of the airport, more than a minute before the crash. And here's an email from Rich in California. He says, Hello, Max. I enjoyed listening to your latest podcast about the Learjet crash at Gillespie Field in San Diego, especially the part about your attempt to recreate the accident in your simulator. I also attempted to recreate the accident in my simulator, setting the weather as best as possible to the METAR and setting the time to evening. When I recreated the flight, I saw that when turning for the 27 right pattern, I was flying behind Rattlesnake Mountain, which completely blocked all the airport lights. In addition, Rattlesnake Mountain didn't look like a mountain. To me, it looked like a big black object without any form or substance, since there are no lights on the mountain. The black hole of the mountain was further obscured by the low ceiling and mist, so it might be possible the pilot may have thought the black hole was a thick cloud. I'm a rusty pilot, licensed in 1988. As with many other pilots, life, family, and work had me postpone keeping current. Now I am retired and possibly getting current. However, I have some medical issues that would probably block me from getting the medical. I'm thinking of flying under sport pilot rules that only need a driver's license for the medical. Thank you for your excellent, thought-provoking podcast. Well, thanks so much for your email, Rich, and good luck to getting back into flying. By the way, that's a very common story. I've talked with many pilots who've had 10, 20, 30-year gaps and are now getting back into flying. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Jackson Maddox. He says, Hi, Max. I want to thank you again for your podcast. I passed my IFR check run on December 4th. Just before real winter settled into Minnesota. Yeah, I've been up there in January. You guys have real winter. Before my check ride, I went back and re-listened to several of your IFR-related episodes, and they were very helpful. The mock oral check ride episode was particularly helpful. The irony of getting an IFR rating in Minnesota is that when it's needed, you really don't need to be flying, minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit with low clouds and winds gusting to 25 knots, for example. But I intend to use my IFR rating to look into angel flights and similar public benefit flying after listening to episode 212. Well, Jackson, that's great. I know that we've got a number of listeners who do public benefit flying, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And here's a question from Aaron in Newfoundland, Canada. He says, I'm really interested if you or any of your colleagues are users of Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. If so, what's your opinion? What are the benefits and pitfalls of would-be pilots using this as the only practice tool before making the transition into real flight training. Thanks again for all your great content, and if I ever find myself in California, it would be an honor to pay you to take me up for the first time. Well, Aaron, I'd love to come visit you in Newfoundland. I've been to Nova Scotia, but I never quite made it to Newfoundland. Anyway, I wrote back to Aaron and said there are some benefits, but also some pitfalls. The biggest downside, and I see this very consistently with everyone who's used Flight Simulator before coming to me as a student pilot, and that is that these pilots don't look outside. They stare at the instruments all the time, which is what they did with Flight Simulator. So a student pilot should probably be looking outside the window about 90% of the time. And I found it's pretty hard to break pilots of this bad habit that they develop while training on a computer flight simulator before they start pilot training. Now, some of the benefits are that you'll understand the basics of using the flight controls, and you can learn a lot about the avionics, such as the Garmin G1000. Most flight sims are not very good for learning how to land, though. And that's how we spend most of our time in the airplane, so just don't expect that to help you much with the landings. Thanks so much for your email, and good luck to you with flight training. Here's an email from Patreon supporter Louis Abascal. He says, I listen to your podcast, and I find it very useful and enjoyable. I heard your episode about the pilot headlamps, and I have to say it's tough to find a good headlamp that fits a pilot's needs. I bought the Flight Outfitters, but the hinge part is so fragile that I accidentally dropped it from about waist high and the hinge broke. I think they can make a more robust design. So then I came across and bought the LED Lenser H3.2, which has an attenuator in the back that regulates the light from 120 lumens to 5 lumens, but the downside is it does not have a red light. So I used a bottle cap that fits the outside of the lamp, cut the center out, sanded the threads with a Dremel, and stacked 3 discs from a red light filter and found my solution. I hope this might help other pilots with a headlamp issue. If you're interested in more pics or information on this hack, let me know. Well, Luce, that's great. And I agree. When I did that evaluation of about 6 different headlamps for pilots, I was disappointed there was really nothing out there that fit my idea of what a pilot should have for a headlamp. And here's a message from mega supporter Rob Thomas, who's recently signed up to support the show. He says, Max, I was sitting in my garage listening to your recent episode on CFIT, and I thought, wow, I have a lot of monthly subscriptions for streaming services, etc., but none of them give me information that could one day save my life and the life of my passengers. I don't think it's exaggerating to say that I usually learn at least one thing in each of your episodes that could do that. He says, as for me, I consider myself a relatively new pilot, got my private in March of 2017, instrument rating in July of 2019, and fly a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion between Atlanta and the Maryland, Virginia area, where 7 of my 8 grandkids live, which has pushed my flight time up to about 850 hours. Well, that's a lot for 4 years. Congratulations. I'm an executive leading the R&D team of Manhattan Associates, a supply chain and commerce software company, and thinking about becoming a CFI when I retire to the Maryland, Virginia area in the next year or so. One last item, my son Matt got his interest in aviation from me. I did a lot of Microsoft Flight Simulator and took him to many air shows when he was growing up, and I got my inspiration to become a pilot from him after becoming his first passenger when he got his private in 2011. He is currently deployed on the USS Carl Vinson flying the F-18F Super Hornets. He was training at Meriden, Mississippi when he called to tell me about Wallace Birch. God rest his soul. And Wallace, of course, was a naval aviator who died in an accident that we've talked about in the past. He's the son of another one of our mega supporters. Rob, thanks so much for your email. And let me mention some special people, see if you recognize any of these names. We have 2 new mega supporters, which is perfect because we just lost 2 in the last week or 2. So we're still staying even. Ed Perry edited his pledge up to $50 a month. Ed, thank you so much. And we have another new mega supporter named Eric. I don't have a last name for him, but I'll tell you more about Ed and Eric in a future show. And my thanks to these other patrons who've just signed up in the last 2 weeks. See if you know any of these people. Phil Smith down in Australia. Andrew Sinclair, who edited his pledge up to $20. Cole. Rick Kennan at $20 a month. Greg Hughes edited up to $8 a month. Jim Jensen, who I've known for many years, thanks for joining us at the $20 a month level. Russ Irwin edited his pledge up to $20 a month. Russ and I are scheduled to fly later in the week. Martin Mitrega, who signed up at the €7 level, so Martin must be in Europe somewhere. Dave Speranza at the $8 a month level, and Alex F. We also had some one-time donations via PayPal, including $150 from Bradley Wallace an anonymous donation for $50. Thanks so much for everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. And as I mentioned before, we often are just barely staying even because every month several people have credit cards that expire and then they don't get around to renewing them. So we've actually lost 10 people in the last 2 months for exactly that reason. And that's why it's so hard to grow our base. So I would really appreciate it if you've given any thought about, maybe I should support the show. Now would be a great time to sign up and become a member because we're trying to backfill for all of those credit cards that expired last week. So just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, or you could go to aviationnewstalk.com/Patreon and read about all the goodies that you'll get at the different membership levels. Or you can make a one-time donation if you'd like by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Thanks again for your support. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.